So I'm also part of the Cattle Hoof Care Standards Board, and that was a board set up basically trying to improve industry standards on lameness and basically trying to control the conversation to ensure that we as the agricultural industry weren't being attacked by external forces with sort of vested interests. And one thing that sort of comes to me day after day in terms of what I do, the more I learn, the less I know, but also the objective in reality of what I do day to day with clients is how can I allow my clients' cows to be more like the cows that they've been bred to do. So how can we take away those barriers that are stopping those cows producing to their genetic potential and therefore having a long-lasting, healthy life? But also alongside that, the industry's changing and we've got to be critical and questioning of what we do, but also intelligence, not because you think you know everything without questioning, but rather because you question everything you think you know. And I think probably the last few years as an industry, we've learned a lot with milk prices being variable for a lot of clients, but also in terms of some of the things we used to do as standard practice, we've been able to challenge them and question our thinking to ensure that our clients have better returns at farm level. I always get sort of talked or asked sometimes, what does a consultant do? And I always like to put the official version as a person who provides expert advice professionally, or as an old boy in the village down here calls me, someone who asks for your watch, tells you the time and then charges you for it. But joking aside, there's a whole host of doing things and there's a whole range of systems that we can follow in our industry. And just because 6 and 3 equals 9, but so does 5 plus 4. And the way you do things is not always the only way to do them. And I think that's important, especially when we're doing generic conversations or generic presentations. But just because one thing works on one farm doesn't mean it would work on the other farm. But likewise, it means that we should still keep our eyes open and be observant of what successes other people can have in terms of what we can learn from. The challenge we get from an industry is the Holstein is often blamed, either in terms of she's not efficient enough or she doesn't last long enough. But in reality, the challenge we've got is often human genetics rather than animal genetics. And the challenge we've got is how can we take those barriers away from those cows to allow them to produce to their genetic potential that you as a cow owner has created. But also your system, and there's no such thing as one right system. What's right for one person is wrong for another. It doesn't matter whether your cows are pink, green, orange, black, or whether you're high input, high output, low output, milk once a day. Basically, it depends where you sit and where your comforts are, and depends how good a dancer you are. And by that, I mean, some people shouldn't have high yielding Holstein cows, and likewise, some people shouldn't have grazing cows. It depends how good you are and what reflects your skill set. So sometimes that steady dancing method is right because it's profitable, it's safe, it's right for you as a business, or likewise a more intense, more aggressive approach in terms of a more extreme level. But basically it comes back to how do we look after our cow and how do we monitor that nutrition and those building blocks, which is partly what I'll go through as we go through the presentation. But the whole objective is how can we let that cow be a cow and how can we let her do what we have created her to be. And I always start off, our industry is a different industry to what it used to be, and it's changed massively over the last 20 years, let alone the last 5. And what I always say is every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up, it knows that it must run faster than the fastest lion or it'll be killed. Likewise, every morning in Africa, a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. And by that, I mean, actually, it doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a gazelle, but basically when the sun comes up, you better be running. And that's the challenge we've got as an industry. There's obviously lots of changes on the way through Brexit and what that means for us. There's obviously the changes and financial challenges that are going to be coming on the way to the country in terms of coronavirus, but also in terms of us as an industry. We have to be more efficient. We have to be better at what we do just to stand still. And in reality, that then comes back to our business partner. And in reality, as a business partner, we have a dairy cow contract. And that contract is a barter of housing, feeding, safety, and comfort in exchange for milk and meat. Basically, you look after me and I'll provide you milk and meat in return. And in reality, it comes back to trust. Are we letting that cow trust us to allow her to do what she's been bred to do and deliver those results for you as a business owner? The challenge we've got in that is there's no limit to how many cows one person can neglect. And that is very individual, and that's very different. Sometimes those extra 5 cows on the system are the bit that breaks the system. And I got involved with plenty of businesses over the years where we've reduced stock numbers, and actually that's been the right thing for the business. And as a result of that reduced pressure, they've actually then made more money. But in terms of then looking at rest and how we sort of function with that cow, and how we sort of, and these are just sort of thoughts for winter in terms of to give you some thought as to think about as you walk around your sheds before bringing cows in for winter. So our biggest need for a cow is actually time to rest. And the interesting thing is that lying to a cow is more important than eating. And the challenge we get with reduced resting is it also reduces feeding. And the reason that is because cows will spend more time waiting in passages to lie down than eating. We're overstocked. So if we've got passages shut up whilst cows are waiting to come back out to the parlour, and actually we're overstocked in that time, actually cows will spend more time waiting to lie down than opposed to go back to the barrier. And also the thing we've got to consider is the more we can get our dry cows to eat, which I'll come on to later in the presentation, basically the greater our dry matter intake in early lactation. And that's critical from not only a milk output production, but also in terms of overall health and welfare. And ideally what we're looking for is what I call vitamin R, so vitamin rest, and we're targeting 12 to 14 hours a day of rest. The challenge we have with that is we're often 3.5 hours per day outside of the pen. So if you imagine times waiting to be milked, time standing in the collecting yard, time standing in the yard to come back to the sheds whilst the bed's being done, or AI time or foot trimming time, actually to try and get that 12 to 14 hours of rest is actually quite hard. Resting then brings more effective rumination. So obviously the more we can get our cows to ruminate, the more buffering they'll produce. And that in turn gives less stress. And as a result of less stress, that changes cell level activity and brings better immunity with it. There is also better blood circulation to feet and udder, which then takes off pressure and lameness, which I'm sure Sarah will comment on in the webinar on lameness that's due in the next week or so. So why is resting important? Basically, the more we can get our cows to rest, there's a relationship back to milk yield. So the longer time we can get to rest over that 12-hour period, basically those cows will produce us more milk. So what is the time then? What does a cow actually do in her life or her daily life as such? So typically she's going to spend about 5 hours eating. She'll spend, interestingly, half an hour eating, or half an hour drinking, sorry. Typically 3 hours gossiping, chatting, wandering around, standing, looking out over the gate. Typically 3 hours a day of milking or AI or lameness, moving around sheds. So that takes up a total of 11.5 hours. So that gives us 12.5 hours of resting time, assuming that we can keep our chores, milking, treatment to 3 hours. That can be a challenge on a lot of herds. So maybe have a look at your herd and sort of time from when you start that first cow in the collecting yard to when the last cow is out to the collecting yard. What is that time frame? Can you reduce that? Can you, if you can't, can you split up groupings? So bringing less cows to the collecting yard in one go. Or likewise, this is where 3 times a day steps in, because one of the benefits 3 times a day brings is because cows are moving around more often, there's generally less standing time and less chores in the system as such. So what are we trying to do when we house our animals? And this is one thing I want you to try and look at your accommodation over the next few days before cows do come in, or even if they are in already, how your cows respond to your housing that you've got. So typically a cow has 4 normal resting positions. And what we're trying to do is design cubicles or sheds that allow the cow to mimic these normal resting positions in the shed as well. So typically we have a long resting position, a short resting position where the cow will curl up more like a dog. We've got a wide resting position where she'll stretch her front foot over and far, or likewise she's a narrower, so generally she'll still stretch forward, but her back legs aren't stretched out as far. There's also a 5th one, which is when the cow's lying flat out and looks as if she's dead. But also alongside that, we're trying to manage facilities with a cow that doesn't actually exist in your herd. So we've got a range of cows. Generally, we've got a mixture of heifers that are still growing, all the way to third, fourth, fifth lactation, very large mature cows. And it's trying to find a happy medium that sort of targets all those without compromising welfare on any of them too much. But the challenge we've got is we can say we've got 1 cow per cubicle, but actually if our cubicles are too small or our space is too tight, actually have we got optimum comfort in those cubicles? So for example, this cow in the middle, is she actually comfy? Can she rest as much as she wants to? And therefore, are we indexing cows by restraint? And by restraint, I mean putting steelwork and forcing cows to do things, or actually we're giving cows a safe position that she can choose to do what she wants. And in reality, cubicles aren't there for cows to lean on or cows to rest against. In reality, they're there to stop cows stepping on each other, for want of a better description. So how much shiny metalwork have you got in your cubicle sheds? If there's lots of shiny metal, you suggest that we've got room to tweak things and could tweak things to make cow comfort better. And again, going back to that previous slide, is this 1 stall per cow? So is another cow going to come and go in that right-hand stall next to her? Or will she come and have a look and stay waiting for that cow's leg to move? So what is normal and abnormal behavior in our sheds then? So basically, mid-morning after you've milked and done your chores, how many cows are standing up, just mooching, not doing anything? How many cows are perching, half in, half out of cubicles? How many cows are diagonally standing? If we've got cows diagonally standing, there's 2 things: either the head rail's too low, or actually our platform is too short. So either there's a wall in front of her obstructing her, or there's a cow in her social space in front of her. How many cows are straight, standing and lying? So by that I mean they're standing straight and lying straight. Or also how many cows haven't even read the book and are doing what they want. They're very comfy and can get out, but actually they're still not positioning themselves properly and taking time to rest. How many cows are restless? So paddling around in cubicles, almost a bit unrestly, a bit uncomfortable, and therefore they're not lying and resting, they're just lying and moving and getting frustrated. How many cubicles have we got where there's every other cow? So actually we've got a cow lying in one, then a space, then another cow, and likewise the opposite them. Basically then generally that means that platforms are too short, so there's a cow obstruction in the way, and the cow will not come into that middle cubicle because she has to lunge into where the other cow is and doesn't like doing that from a social point of view. That can happen in new sheds. This is a shed that was only a year old when I took this photo. So just because it's shiny, just because it's new, just because it looks posh, doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Likewise, have we got obstructions? So again, cubicle bed lengths are good in this shed, but actually because there's an RSJ there, and then there's a cow's head into her social obstruction, actually she's decided to kneel down as opposed to go and lie down. How many cows are dog sitting? How many are nose pressing on steel? You generally don't see that in cows much anymore. You'll generally more see it in bulls in bull pen. But what we're trying to do, if you look at the bottom corner of the screen, is we're trying to mimic that cow getting up and down as if she was grazing. So if you watch a cow grazing, basically she comes down quickly. Play that again. So the cow inside just struggled a bit there, banged her head, shuffled forward. Whereas if you look at that cow grazing, straight up, leg out, stretch, and then she's off. So again, how much comfort are we hitting by those cows not being able to get up or down? So what are we trying to do? How does a cow get up? So basically she'll throw her head forward, throw herself forward, back legs come out, front leg comes under, she'll stand up, stretch, often then go to the toilet, and then she'll come out of our cubicle. Likewise, when she's lying down, generally that cow will come into the cubicle. Even though we don't get predators to cows in the UK, they will still be looking out for risks and danger. So she'll spend some time looking around. Where is she? Is she safe? Where's her escape routes? Once she's looked at everything, she'll take a view as to, right, I'm safe. I know where I'm going. I'm ready to go down. And then finally, once she's decided that back legs move in, head goes down, front knees go down, and then she falls back with her final legs sliding back under her. And the aim is we're trying to mimic that, so then she lies down in that position, she's in the right position, her tail ends over the end of the cubicle so she can muck in the passageway, and she can then start ruminating and cutting away. Likewise, if we've got smaller platforms, are our cubicles wide enough for cows to lunge through the side? So in that example there, there's a cow with social obstruction in front of her, so she's lunging to the side. So then as a result of that, are our cubicle size is allowing us to do that? So have we still got lots of shiny metal on the bottom bar, or do we keep getting broken cubicles or broken bottom brackets, or likewise bent cubicles? So just check. You'd be amazed how many cubicles after a year or so are all different sizes, or likewise sometimes even on new sheds that they've been put in, they still aren't the same size all the way down the shed. So that's one thing to check if you are putting new sheds up, but also in existing sheds as well. So sand, we can move to sand. Sand's the gold standard, but we've got to remember that sand still needs maintaining, still needs looking after. So the challenge we've got for this cow here is she can't side lunge through the cubicle because the bar is so high. But likewise, we've got a sand obstruction in front of her. So although she's got a bob zone obstruction, so though it's soft, it's sand, she's still hitting her chin as she gets up and goes down. And that's what we want to avoid, because basically that gives a negative memory about that cubicle bed. Likewise, this is a dry cow, and that's a 9 foot bed or 9 foot passage. And you can just see in terms of how much room that cow does take to get up. Her nose nearly touches that wall. So if there are walls in front, what's the bed length? Have we got 9 foot of bed length, or is there a wall in the way? And can we do anything about that, which I'll come on to later. Likewise, we might have tried to make our cubicles more accessible by removing walls, but have we removed enough? So this cow was slightly lame. She went in the cubicle and lay down, got down and wasn't comfortable, goes to get back up, shuffles forward, bangs her chin, and just when she's coped with that, she bangs her head. So that's not going to be a pleasant experience for her. And in reality, she'll then spend time standing longer, which in turn will result in more sole ulcers and bruising. Likewise, if we look at videos, so each second in this video is a minute of time. And when we got it wrong, when you speed things up and just get a chance to watch, it becomes obvious. So you can see cows coming into here. There's quite a bit of light difference between parts of the shed. There's obviously an air ventilation challenge with the way cows are sniffing the air, but it's noticeable that how few cows actually come in and actually lie down. They'll stand on the sides of the cubicles, they'll wander down the cubicles, they'll wander down the passageway. Whereas when we get it right, cows generally come back to the cubicles, find their bed, lie straight down. And as I said earlier, the quicker we can get those cows to lie down in optimum comfort, all it means is that they're looking after themselves, we're managing health and welfare, and they will produce more milk and will last longer. So in terms of cubicles, we've obviously got various bedding types. The gold standard would be deep sand. And the reason that's the gold standard is basically we get less abrasions because the sand gives. There's more comfort because the sand is a cushioning effect. There's the benefit, obviously, it's because it's inert, assuming that the beds drain and organic matter doesn't build up. But obviously there's a challenge there from a human nature in terms of how we manage that sand and the labour of that sand, but not only in terms of cost of that sand. So there's plenty of clients I've got who can't go into sand purely because of haulage costs to them making sand too expensive. We've then got mattresses and water beds. We tend not to see many water beds in the UK. I'm not personally a fan of water beds, generally because as the cow goes down, the water displaces from underneath her and she hits the concrete. Although she's on rubber, she hits the concrete before the water settles back. There's mats and mattresses. There's cheap mats, there's cheap mattresses. There's expensive mats and there's expensive mattresses. Basically, cheap is cheap, so you will have to replace it sooner rather than later because of the lack of cushioning. And also just on mattresses, be aware of some mattresses have very rough top covers, so you tend to get more hair abrasion and a bigger risk of hock sores and skin damage as a result. There's also green bedding. Some farms doing green bedding. It can work well if you follow the rules. There's ongoing debates whether whether that should be allowed. But if it's done properly and done well, it can work very well because it is very soft on the cow. I've got a lot of clients now moving to milled straw. So actually we would mill straw down to about 10 to 15 mil, and that becomes it's a very soft bed. And I've managed on quite a few clients to to totally get rid of hock sores as a result of moving to that as a bedding source, as opposed to sawdust. So in terms of cubicle widths and what does that mean to a cow perspective? So basically, ideally for today's Holstein, you'd want a 48-inch width cubicle center to center, so 4 foot. So basically a 48-inch width cubicle gave an hour of extra lying time versus a 44. But the thing to remember is your most used stall is generally dirtiest. So sometimes when I go into sheds on an audit, I'm looking at welfare and comfort levels, I'll try and find the dirtiest cubicle and try and see if that's any different to all the others. Is that just there's one cow who always goes there that is the dirty cow, or actually are the dimensions in that cubicle different? Because from a comfort perspective, the most comfortable cubicle is one without a brisket board and without a headrail. But obviously from a human perspective, that would give us a dirty bed because the cow is deciding where she wants to position as opposed to where we want her to position. So whatever we do with cows in those sheds, in cubicles, is a compromise to try and give her optimum comfort, but also try to give us as humans optimum cleanliness. On a head-to-head, ideally minimum of 16-foot heads-to-heads. And the reason that being is to avoid that social obstruction of cows lunging forward. A minimum of 9 foot if against a wall to allow that lunge space as that head goes down. But also we want a wide enough loop that cow can side lunge. So typically what we're looking is a top loop sort of 50 inches off the ground and the bottom loop being typically about 12 inches off the ground. Not too low, so if she gets her leg under it and gets up, she breaks her leg. Likewise, if she wants to step over it in a panic, she can, but also that there's then enough room so as she lunges through it, she doesn't hit her chin as she lunges. As I said earlier, mattresses, we can have challenges with mattresses just because of some of the abrasive top covers that are out there, especially if you're feeling quite a rough bitty sawdust with that as well. Also, we've got the challenge of often a lot of people don't put enough bedding down, and therefore that increases the sort of sandpaper effect onto that cow's hock. And in work, if they increase sawdust levels to 7.5 kilos per cow per day, that gave an extra 2.5 hours of lying time per cow per day. Now, obviously, I'm not saying do that, we're not going to do that, but it just sort of reiterates how important bedding and covering of the mattress or mat, actually how important that is to lying times. But likewise, sand, we could talk about sand being the gold standard, but sand still needs to be maintained and sand still needs to be looked at. So if we looked at a typical sand bed or deep sand bed being about 6 inches of sand, for every decrease in inch under that 6 inches, so if we went from 6 inches to 5 inches, typically you'd find 25 minutes less or reduced lying time. So again, just because it's sand doesn't mean to say it's perfect. If we then look at perching, so in a 44-inch cubicle, cows perch for 90 minutes. In a 48-inch cubicle, they perch for 70 minutes. And in a 52-inch cubicle, they perch for 60 minutes. So again, just reiterating, trying to minimize that cow standing time so that she does lie down and takes that pressure off her feet. But the important thing is, if we have got lame cows, is make sure you get them off mattresses. And the reason that is because that mattress doesn't have any give in it, whether it be a mattress or a mat. What we tend to find when you start videoing cows is they go to lie down and get to that final foot position where they're almost on their toe, and basically they then get the pain, stop lying down and stand back up. Or likewise, they're lying down, they go to get up, and as that final foot goes down to take the weight, it hurts too much, so they stay lying down. So generally what that means is they take longer to recover. So a slower recovery rate, but also we then get more lameness and more health problems as a result of them in reality not eating enough. The other thing that might be of interest to you is actually if cows are fed twice a day versus once a day, generally they would also lie down for 20 minutes more. Now, obviously that's not practical for some people, but for some clients where we've got small feeder wagons and there's a lot of mixing in a day, we sometimes split that feeding up and ended up with 2 times a day rather than a massive feed out in the morning. It takes a lot of time, and that does benefit the cow. The other thing we're looking at is what's our feed placement to the cow. So this is where the feed sits, so our feed barrier, and ideally what we're looking for is that feed floor to be 10 centimeters higher. And the reason that is, we want that cow to be able to reach it without stretching. So if we're getting front feet lameness, generally that means that our cows are pushing and stretching to get feed. So ideally you want that 10 centimeters higher, and that allows then the cow to stand square and reach feed. Whereas obviously if you look at a cow grazing, she'll always stand 1 foot in front of the other, so she can get down to that grass at floor level, if that makes sense. So ideally we want that floor level of 10 centimeters higher than her standing level. And typically we're looking at a barrier height of 48 to 51 inches above her standing height. So from her feet to the barrier. So why is cubicle bed important? So as I said, in terms of platform length, a 15-foot bed, we'll always get one cow lying straight, one cow lying diagonally. 16-foot, you might get two heifers lying straight, but a heifer and the cow would still be diagonal. Whereas 17, 18-foot platform will then have two cows lying straight because they haven't got a social obstruction. And the difference between that is just in terms of that internal space between the two. It looks wasted space, but until you see those cows bob forward, and they actually do utilize all that space. Just going back to cubicle widths again, that restraint by design or intention. So that 48-inch width of that mature cow there on the left-hand side, or a 54-inch on the right-hand side. Now, obviously, there's considerations around that in terms of, I'm not saying go out tomorrow and change all your cubicle sizes to 54 inches, far from it. But I just want to reiterate that that width is critical to that cow comfort and that introduction of steel. But obviously, to do that, we still do need platform sizes to be correct. Otherwise, that cow will lie diagonally, and you will then get manure under the bottom bar on the left-hand side or right-hand side. Or likewise, the cow will shuffle forward and be lying at a sort of bigger diagonal curve. So if we've got old sheds, or we haven't got much money to tweak those sheds, is what can we do? So often from a lunge space perspective, it's taking out walls. So can we knock walls out? Can we knock barriers out? Can we take those walls out and put an angled sheet back down? So at the bottom of where the wall was, you've still got say a two foot space that you can lunge to, but at head height, it's still back to vertical. That works quite well and is relatively cheap to do. Can we replace cubicles? So sometimes I have replaced cubicles, so gone for wider, taller loops. That's made a big difference to lying times, even if the widths are still wrong. Can we do a shallow sand conversion if our beds are poor or our mattresses are poor? So that would be a 4-inch angle line or 2-inch angle line on the back of the bed, bolted on top, with 2 to 3 inches of sand then on the bed. That works very well, does provide good comfort and reduces sand usage compared to deep bed. But also, can we modify the headrail? So sometimes that's pushing that headrail forward an inch, or actually raising it up in the air to give us that 50 inches of space as such. Outside loafing space is something everyone always asks about. There's very limited research in terms of saying the benefits of loafing space, but all I can say to that is whenever you do have a loafing space, you'll always find cows in it, which suggests that cows do like it, whether that's more of a conversational area or somewhere to go and stand in the sun. They do tend to like it. So if you can put some loafing area in that is space and you can keep clean, I would definitely consider it. If we then look at 2-row barns versus 3-row barns, so this is 2 rows of cubicles per 1 feed fence versus 3 rows of cubicles versus 1 feed fence. So what's the difference? So typically on a 2-row shed, we can get 27 to 29 inches of feed space. In a 3-row shed, that will go down to 16 to 18 inches. Typically, though, why people put 3-row sheds in is they're cheaper per cow place, because we get more cows in a tighter space. So typically they would be up to 20% cheaper. The challenge with that is we can use yokes in a 2-row shed. We haven't got enough space to yoke all those cows in the 3-row shed. The other challenge we've got is in terms of cow cleanliness and also lameness from a foot health point of view, from either wet feet or slurry coated feet, especially if using auto scrapers, because we've got 20% less surface area per cow. And the reason that's important is obviously a lot of milk buyers are now moving towards cow cleanliness scores. So that's going to become more critical of what our perception of cow cleanliness is going forward. Likewise, there'll be 40% less water space in a 3-row shed. but also we need a higher wind speed to actually ventilate those sheds. So typically, unless it's a really windy day, generally in a 3-row shed, to minimize the risks of heat stress and also give enough clean air movements, you're tending to then having to look at putting fans in. So 2-row shed is perfect for all cows. Ideally, if you're doing a 3-row shed, you only put pregnant cows onwards in it because of those pressures. So talking about feed space and design then, why is it important? So basically it comes back to, as I said earlier, less stress, more immunity, and reduced lameness from a resting perspective. But also that's even more critical to our dry cows and how they start off. So for each 10% increase in close-up stocking density above a stocking rate of 80%, there's a 3/4 of a kilogram per day decrease in milk. So what we're typically looking for a Holstein is 100, if we're on loose housing, 100 square foot of bedded area. That's before scraping passages or before feed fence, but 100 square foot. But basically, if you stop that at 80% of 100 square foot, you potentially would get more milk. And the challenge we've got then is by minimizing or reducing that stocking pressure, those cows will eat more, which means they'll eat more in fresh lactation. And that dry matter intake, as we come up to calving, as that cow is thinking about calving, that dry matter intake drops. So come day 5 before calving down to day 0, that dry matter intake can drop down to 6-7 kilos. And typically it will decrease by up to 30%. And basically that cow's dry matter intake 1 day before calving is totally interlinked to the dry matter intake 21 days after calving. So the more we can reduce or minimize that dry matter intake drop, the more we can get cows to eat later on. And by getting cows to eat more later on, basically that means that we can push more forage into diets as opposed to concentrate. But not only does that give a friendlier diet, but also it gives us a cheaper diet because we're not having to buy in as many concentrates, assuming forage stocks are okay. As I mentioned, milling straw earlier. So where I put in milling straw versus rotor-ground straw. So milling would take it a lot finer than a rotor-ground. Typically, I've seen a 2 kilograms dry matter intake increase to the same group of cows. And so every time I introduce that for any herd, typically we'll see a 2 kilograms lift in dry matter intake, which then means easier to manage cows later on in their lactation. And the thing is why that's important. So basically we can start picking out cows with metritis or at risk of metritis based on their dry matter intake relative to the time before they calve. So for every 10-minute decrease in average daily feeding time, cows were twice as likely to be diagnosed with metritis. So that's important then in terms of how we introduce cows, how we manage cows, and how we stop those pens as those cows come through that system. Going on to feeding then, and why is feeding important? Well, the amazing thing is cows have an aggressive feeding drive. Now, you wouldn't believe that this is a straight steel bar the cows have bent. And competition at feeding is inevitable. We've got a herd of cows, they're all wanting to get that feed. There's always going to be competition. The challenge we've got with that is cows will willingly exert over 200 kilos of pressure, and 100 kilos of pressure will cause actual tissue damage. And that's why we call it aggressive feeding. So actually the cow will physically hurt herself to go and eat. So if we've got lots of neck calluses on cows, that just is basically a tissue damage from that cow putting pressure. So if you look at your cows and you see a lot of hair missing on their necks, on the top there where they're touching that barrier, we need to adjust that barrier, either lifting it up or also moving it forward. If we then look at feed space, so if you remember earlier I said typically on a yoke, there'd be 24 to 30 inches of feed space per cow versus a 3-row barn, which would be down to 18 inches. Well, if we looked at 40 inches of feed space versus 20 inches, so that gave 60% more spaces between cows. That gave 57% fewer aggressive interactions whilst feeding, and also gave a 24% increase in feeding during 90 minutes after fresh feed delivery. So it basically changes that animal's behavior. So basically that resulted in better performance of the supporting cows, so heifers. And basically it's just a challenge of can we make sure our sheds are at a minimum of 24 inches and ideally 30, especially 30 for cows until they're in calf. And basically there's a negative relationship between greater aggression and health. So basically what I'm saying by that is the more aggressive our cows are, the general poorer health metrics we will have in that herd. Okay, it's easy to say, well, it's fine. Not all the herd is eating at that time, so therefore 12 inches, 14 inches is fine. That is an argument, absolutely. But obviously cows, unless they're a robot herd, cows will still act as a herd and will still eat together, still rest together. So we need to take that into account. So if we look at then overcrowding, so this is 100% stock shed versus 130% stock shed. So basically that changed feeding time from 43% of eating meals to 27%, so less cows eating at one go. And basically overcrowded cows would prefer a cubicle versus post eating after. So again, if we're on the edge of diets at the same time, basically there's poorer rumination, poorer buffering going on, which gives us a bigger risk of acidosis. And even though these rumination differences were massive, the cows were still on the same diet within that. So it's not a diet issue per se, it's a presentation of that diet and the space of the herd. It's a behavioral issue. But what that did to that overstocked shed is basically there was a 2-hour difference in rumination. So that 2-hour difference was worth nearly 9 gallons a day of more saliva and basically 210 grams of natural bicarbonate being produced. So basically, typically you'd advise up to 200 grams of bicarb per day, but the cow was producing that naturally herself when she was stocked correctly. So something to consider if you are under shed pressure is how can you then manage that diet to reduce the impact of that. So what does competition for food and rest do when we're overcrowded? So basically cows then start slug feeding. So they go and almost a bit like a Chinese buffet, stuff themselves and get as much food into them as they quickly as they can. So obviously that then tends to give us a crash in rumen pH and gives a risk in acidosis. They tend to then take shorter meals, and that also gives a greater dry matter depression overall. And in turn, that gives us less rumination, less cutting, less saliva production, and more acidosis, and subsequently, as a result of that, less milk. But also it's how do we present that feed to cows? Are we contaminating feed ourselves? Are we putting barriers in front of those cows so actually the feed is there, but the cow can't physically get enough to it, or that heifer or sick cow who comes and eats later on in the day on her own actually can't ever get the right amount of intake into it because she can't reach that feed. Likewise, if we've got aggressive going on because actually the feed fence floor is lower than where the cows are standing. So coming back to that then, ideally we want our head rail for the feed barrier typically about 50 inches above the floor standing and ideally 6 inches out. The feed rail is there not to keep, it's almost there to keep cows from escaping as opposed for cows to lean on. And that in itself makes a massive difference to intakes. Again, if we've got headlocks or locking yokes, on a 24-inch headlock, we'll only ever get about 80% stocking rate purely because there's those cows' bellies are in there where we can't get. On a 30-inch headlock, you will get 100% fill and we'll get 100% utilization. So that's something to consider as well. If you are putting down locking yokes, is our 24-inch locking yokes too small for you? Likewise, if you are introducing locking yokes to heifers or to dry cows as the first instance, make sure if they're new to them, there is still a post and rail available, that if they aren't putting their heads through the barrier, they still can go down to the end of the shed and they have got somewhere they can still access feed so their dry matter intake doesn't crash. Likewise, look at options for robot presentation or robot pushing up. You might have seen, I did an article in the Forager magazine looking at cost effectiveness of robot feeding and robot pushes. If you haven't seen that and would like a copy, drop me a text, drop me an email, or mention it to Gwennon, and I'll gladly pass that on to you. Coming on to water then, and water is often forgotten about, purely from if we're on boreholes, what is our flow rates like, especially if we've increased cow numbers over the years, pulling on that. So if we typically look at a 45% dry matter ration, which is typical, milk yield of 20 litres, a cow will need to drink 55 litres, whereas a 50-litre cow will need to drink 130 litres. So have we got enough water in reserve? Have we got flow rates enough to allow cows to do that? Where's our water quality coming from? Cows will look at water on smell and taste as opposed to taste overall. So do our troughs smell? Have we got bacteria growing in those troughs? Those troughs should be clean ideally. Does our water flow keep up, especially in the hot spells, and this year being a classic example? The range of that water intake and how that can change is massive. And especially then also to our dry cows. It's great having straw choppers, but if all we do is fill up the water troughs so that they can't actually drink water, we've then got dehydrated animals who will then get sick. So one thing to remember is a cow will drink 50% more water as the temperature goes from 30 to 35 degrees centigrade. And typically they want to drink 50 to 60% of the requirements after milking. So the more access to trough space you can have after exiting the parlour, that'll help cows' water intake. And the thing to remember, if suddenly you're feeding a dry silage out of the clamp, or you moved cuts onto a drier cut, water requirements can increase massively. So it might be then that it's more effective to actually put water into the TMR to reduce that TMR dry matter back down to 45, as opposed to let them try and drink it themselves. A bit then in terms of winter feeding and things to think about this winter. If you haven't already considered winter pricing, now would probably be time to start looking at it with your feed supplier. These are current prices versus 12 months ago. So wheat is typically up £27 a tonne, biscuit meals are up £27 a tonne, molasses is up £19 a tonne, palm kernel up 17, wheat distillers are 6. Maize distillers is fallen by 6, rape meal is up about 2, soya hulls are up at 2, soya is down by 8, whole maize is down by 8, and barley is only up 3. Barley is very cost effective and value for money against wheat at the moment, so typically you could make quite a cheap blend this winter of barley, maize grain, rape and soya hulls. But it's one to consider. Barley, soya hulls, rape and whole maize at the moment are good buys. So maybe discuss that with your feed supplier. Obviously there's the risk of Brexit and supplies on all those unknowns as well. So plan and try and prevent those risks to your business. Then a little quick comment about condition score. So why is it important? Basically, it's the foundation to the herd and that success. And what we're trying to avoid is basically fat cow, thin cow syndrome. So by that I mean is we'll have a cow that calves down as fat and overconditioned. Because then her intake is lower, she generally has a health incidence. Her intake is then lower in early lactation, so she loses too much weight. She then doesn't get in calf. When she settles down and starts putting weight back on, she's then ready to get in calf, but obviously then is a staler cow. So then she's drying off as a late lactation cow again, or an extended lactation cow, so she puts on weight again. So she can't break that cycle. So generally what you tend to find, if we've got fertility problems on herds, a bit of a general statement, but often it's more of a nutrition problem and fat cow, thin cows coming through that cycle. So calving, ideally we're looking for a 2.5 to 3 condition score. Ideally we're trying not to lose more than half condition score in that first 60 days after calving. And then basically we're trying to dry that cow off to 2.5 to 3 and maintain that condition score through that dry cow period and her calving back down at that level. So why is condition score important? Or why is reducing condition score loss important? Basically, the biggest hit is on fertility and metabolic incidence. So obviously, our biggest risk is ketosis as a fat cow. But basically, those more conditioned cows take longer to get in heat. They take longer to express heat. They take longer, or they have a poor conception rate to start off with. They tend to take more semen per conception and therefore have reduced pregnancy rates overall. So it comes back to economics, and it costs us from a fertility perspective. So main takeaways are minimize stress and maximize cow comfort. What does your shed look like? What do your cows look like? How many hock sores have you got? How many cows have got knocks on their hips or are missing hair? How many shiny cubicles have you got? How much metal work have you got that's shiny, or can you see hair left on it as such? How can you reduce your time away from feed? So minimize the amount of time that cows are away from those cubicles. But also, are you putting enough bedding down? And that's going to be critical this winter. Obviously, straw is going to be short. So make sure you have got enough bedding and can lock into bedding, especially with the risk that we saw earlier this year with coronavirus and the building trade stopped building, the risk and what that caused to sawdust supplies. So definitely a conversation to have with your supplier to make sure you are protected if COVID did come back in winter, that your supply of bedding is still okay. Again, foot, leg and hock health. Have we got optimum comfort? Have we got hock damage as cows go along those cubicles? And what are our locomotion scoring like? And how easy are our cows able to get up and down? We don't have to spend lots of money. We can tweak cubicles quite easily and quite cheaply. There's lots of things you can do before having to rip all cubicles out and reinvest in them. But also don't forget, how is your human interaction? There's still too many herds I see with a dog running up and down the barrier, nipping at cows' noses, or likewise relief staff coming in, being a lot louder than normal staff or family members, and the cows not being comfortable with that. So how do humans interact in your sheds? And do cows come to see those humans, or do the cows run away? But also light and ventilation. Have we got enough light in there? Not only to be pleasant for the cow, but also pleasant for you and safe for you, especially coming into winter, that you can see where you're wandering and there's no trip hazards. But also ventilation. Are we exchanging those air changes enough so that there's fresh air in there at all times? Also, feed access. Is our barrier height correct? Are we looking? Have we got barks on our cows? Can we change our feed barrier style or feed barrier placement so the cows can reach feed better without putting pressure on the necks? How are we presenting that feed in terms of push-ups? What's our water quality and quantity? If you're on a borehole, definitely do a microbiology sample and also a mineral sample on it to see what it has got. You'd be surprised how many borehole waters do actually need filtration and chemical treatment. But also then in terms of our feedstock. So what are our feedstocks like now, and what can we do now to mitigate that? Generally overall, with us around everywhere I do, mid-North Wales, feedstocks are good, but they're also variable in terms of quality. So I've got some excellent first cuts, second cuts, some good start of second cuts, but some of the second cuts where weather came in, they're older and poorer. And there's some third cuts now, third and fourth cuts, which will be older after this rain recently. But also condition of those cows, how are they? But also don't forget infrastructure. So obviously you'll have seen from Farming Connect and also from the Assembly and in GLAD, there is new pollution regulations on their way for Wales and for the whole country from a slurry storage point of view, but also how we spread slurry. They're going to come in and they are going to seem quite hard for a lot of people compared to their infrastructure currently. So if you are short of slurry storage, seek out Farming Connect advice on nutrient management plans to work that out for you, but also consider getting planning now to get that in place before those new rules come in, before everyone starts going in for planning. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Sam, for that informative talk. I'm sure there's quite a lot of information there for us to take away with us. So yeah, we were welcoming any of your questions. Do send them in through the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first on, what do you think of, well, regarding cubicles, what do you think of EasyFix cubicles?
So EasyFix, there's cubicles and cubicles. And I suppose if you look at the EasyFix style, in terms of, I'm assuming you're meaning the flexible and plastic ones. So generally what you avoid then is the hardness of steel, for want of a better description. So there's more give, there's less damage to cows. But what I have found before is sometimes that cows, because there is flex there, they tend to lie how they want because they then lean against the plastic because it gives. Or sometimes I tend to find then heifers walk across the heel stone at the back because they can push past them. I've got clients with them and they work well. I've got clients who've used them and they haven't worked well. It does seem to be farm specific, and that's the same with other makes of cubicles as well. I've got Wilson cubicles that work well in some sheds. Other sheds team will work better. So I think it comes back to how is your herd behavior? How do they work? I think they have got a place, but with those caveats around them.
Great, thank you. You were talking earlier about sort of the cleanliness of the water troughs. We've seen, recently an increase in people using goldfish in water troughs.
Yes, I love goldfish. Goldfish work a treat. it's amazing how much feed gets stuck to the cow's muzzle, and she takes all that expensive blend back into the water trough. But yeah, the fish work very well. Obviously, remember in winter time that you still need flowing water in there so the trough doesn't freeze and they don't die. But yeah, they grow very well in water troughs, and they're nice to see as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on the pollution legislations coming in? Well, when they will come in?
I think there's a where do you start and where do you stop. There's a whole host of debates going on at the moment. Some of that is still flawed science in terms of some of the figures they're using, and that's something we're working on as a company behind the scenes of trying to bring some more up-to-date science on some of the numbers they're using and how that impacts on dairy herds, especially on larger herds. I think there are a lot of challenges we've got as an industry, not only from climate change, but also slurry is being used too much as a dumper as opposed to a fertilizer. And I think once people start realizing how good a fertilizer product it is, when they do start using dribble bars and how much fertilizer we have been able to take out of farms, it makes sense. The challenge we've got with that is a lot of people haven't got enough slurry storage, and that's quite normal as Natural Resources have found out doing all their audit checks recently. And the challenge we've got there as an industry, if I said to all my clients tomorrow, right, you've got to go and build a new slurry store, the money isn't there to do it either. So we've got to have a conversation about that as an industry. As okay, pollution control is good. We should manage pollution. There is still too much pollution in agriculture, and we have to address that from a consumer point of view, because the consumer is very much targeting government on that. But also there's a good fertilizer source that we're not utilizing fully as an industry. But yes, I think there's definitely challenges on cost. That again, someone has to fund that, and I would hope that it's not just the farmer taking the hit as always.
Great, thank you, Sam. I'm aware that we are still running short on time, so I'll just have one more question. What's the risk of having too many fat cows in the herd?
Yeah, so typically the main risk then is if we look at a cow and say our most dangerous time for a cow is at that point of calving. So there's lots of risks then involved in terms of success of that calving, and also stress on the cow from a health perspective. So what we know from a fat cow perspective is, one, they'll have a more difficult calving. They might even also have a bigger calf. So there then could be challenges with the calf. So the calf could be weaker. The cow could get damaged giving birth to that cow. But the big one is we know that cow is then at a higher risk of fatty liver or ketosis. And what that means is basically the cow is trying to break down too much fat because she can't physically eat enough because of her weight. So almost she's overloaded trying to process that fat through her liver, and she physically can't. So she then doesn't eat enough. And that exacerbates things, because then she strips more fat off her back because she doesn't eat enough. And then finally, a month later, she's an actual hat rack. So what that means then is she's more likely to go lame. She's under pressure. So then she generally doesn't hold to first, second, third surface. She doesn't then hit her peak milk production. So we miss out on yield as well. So generally, she's then more likely to start showing signs of estrus or ready to get served and hold sort of day 120, 30, 100, day 40 after calving, which then means she tends to get fat in later lactation again. So we can't break that cycle of her then coming back around as a fat cow the next year as well. So basically, it's a big risk to a cow perspective. So we generally will get more calf deaths, bigger calves, more metabolic disease, and definitely less milk, which all of those combined mean less profit.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sam, for answering those questions and for your time this evening. So again, just to finish off this webinar this evening, in terms of Farming Connect services, many of the pointers that Sam has discussed this evening, you are available to have support through Farming Connect. So do get in touch with either myself and I can pass you on, or get in touch with your local development officers. The training window will be opening 7th of September until the 30th of October. There are some new training services in there, so just have a look to see. Again, with the e-learning module, there are some refresh in the courses there, which you can do free of charge and in your own time at home. The demo farm live next Wednesday will be at Erwfawr in Anglesey, looking at utilising grazing, starting at 7:30. And if you wish to register, just send me an email. Recording of this webinar will be made available on the Farming Connect website in the next couple of days, along with the slideshows in English and Welsh. Os allai i gofyn yn garedig i chi gyd lenwi'r ffurflen gwerthuso ar ôl i'r webinar i orffen, wneith yn helpu ni wella'n gwirionarau ni yn y dyfodol gobeithio. If I can kindly ask you to fill in the evaluation forms at the end, this will help us improve our webinars in the future, hopefully, and have an idea of what webinars you'd like to see. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am ymuno ni heno, a diolch yn fawr iawn i Sam am ei amser e. Felly, cadwch yn saff a nos da i chi. Before we leave you, thank you, Sam, for your time this evening. It's been very informative, and it's nice to see you. Thank you very much for you all for listening as well and joining. So keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you.